To start off with, I think Barry had a nice slide in the beginning of his presentation that was a little bit more comprehensive than what I'm showing here. Just to that point, I'm going to be talking about the air quality regulations that we're dealing with right now, but recognize there are other programs that have environmental regulations that are moving forward, dealing with entrainment and impingement under the Clean Water Act. That's the 316B. And then you have coal combustion waste or coal combustion residuals, and that's ongoing, and the determinations on how to manage that waste. So I'm going to cover briefly on some of these topics. Greenhouse gas regulations, as many of you know, there was some legislation that was passed last year in Wyoming that gave us the authority to manage that. Talk a little bit about regional haze, where we are with that, and then talk about the various components of the CO2 regulations for electric generators. So just briefly on greenhouse gas regulations to get everybody up to speed there. There was a point in time, I will go back through all the history of how the greenhouse gases became a regulated pollutant. But the issue for Wyoming was we had provision in our statute that prevented the agency from addressing greenhouse gases. And anything that had to do with greenhouse gases, we were prohibited from regulating. So we had to get over that hurdle once EPA had established their rules for greenhouse gases. We worked very closely with the legislature and the Minerals Committee in drafting legislation that would allow the agency to regulate greenhouse gases. The issue primarily was that if we couldn't regulate greenhouse gases, industry was faced with dual permitting agencies. We would regulate everything but greenhouse gases and issue one permit, and then EPA was issuing the other permit. Now we coordinated very closely with EPA to ensure that, as best we could, that both those permits would be issued around the same time. But there was always that risk. You might get one half of the equation and you're still waiting for one of the other permits. Well, we submitted our state implementation plan to EPA shortly after that legislation passed, and then EPA approved our state implementation plan in November, and it became effective in December of 2013. So that eliminates this dual permitting process. We do have a few permits that were issued under EPA for greenhouse gases, and we'll work with EPA to transition those back to state permits. On regional haze, regional haze has been something we've been working on for a number of years. We're on the third version of EPA's plan on what the state's plan should look like. We filed, well, there's two, let me just back up, there are two components to regional haze. The first part is what they refer to as 309, which is for the sulfur dioxides. And we submitted that plan a while back, and EPA approved that in December of 2012. But there was an appeal, a petition that was filed with the EPA, and that's ongoing. We filed a brief in defense of that plan, and so that's just an ongoing issue. But that has been approved by EPA, and we're moving forward with that plan. The other component of regional haze is the 309G, which is particulate matter and nitrogen oxides. Now, EPA all along has been in agreement with our plan in addressing particulate matter. It's been, the issue has really been around how we address the best available retrofit technology for facilities that fall under that requirement. So we submitted our plan. EPA provided their partial approval, partial disapproval in 2012. They took comments on that, considered those comments, provided a revised or re-proposal, which, again, it made some changes, but it had some parts were approved, some were disapproved. We, after requests by the governor, the legislature, myself, EPA granted 3 hearings on their proposal. Originally, they had planned on one in a very short time frame. They extended the time frame for public comment and review, which was very much appreciated. But they are under consent decree to meet a deadline for making a determination. They were sued by an organization over our state implementation plan. And in that consent decree, they were to make a decision by November 21st of 2013. Because of the furlough that occurred in October, which also had implications for us and our resources, but because of that, EPA requested an extension from the organization that had filed the suit, and were granted an extension to January 10th. So on January 10th, we received their next proposal, and we're in the process of reviewing that. It's a pretty lengthy document, 714 pages of discussion. We do have, this is a pretty simple slide here, but given the fact that we're just now digging into their 714-page report and trying to make sense of it, I thought this would just be a quick way to describe where we are. In 2012, EPA had approved, the ones that, with the blue bars are the ones that they approved, and I didn't put the specific facilities, just numbered 1 through 15, so I'm going to make a point on that. But they approved 6 of our BART determinations and disapproved 9. And so they issued a federal implementation plan on 9 of those BART units. After considering certain comments that they received on the 2012 version, they came back with a re-proposal and approved 5 of the state's BART determinations and disapproved 10. On this latest version, actually they're headed in the right direction now, which gives me some encouragement that they did take into serious consideration the comments that we provided and industry as well. But they, in this version, approved 10 of the BART determinations and are proposing a federal implementation plan on 5. So we're headed in the right direction, but I don't know that I'm going to send it back to them for a 4th time. I don't know. But what we will be doing is a very thorough and fair assessment of their report. I think we owe them that. That's what we would expect of them on any of our submittals as well. And then we'll decide where we go from there. Okay, so the next big issue that we're dealing with, I remember I said in January 10th, we received the response on our regional haze plan. Well, on January 8th, they also came out with the new source performance standards for new coal-fired generating units, or electric generating units. But before they did that, in 2012, they came out with their first version of regulating carbon emissions, CO2 emissions from electric generating units. They received over 2.5 million comments. And they withdrew that proposal. And then they came back with a proposal that came out here just recently. We've been engaged in discussions with EPA for quite some time. Early on, when the President's executive order and the Climate Action Plan came out, and EPA announced that they had a revised proposal. We were having some early discussions, all the states were, through the Environmental Council of States and other organizations, on what EPA was thinking about. Now, in the original proposal, one of the criticisms was that they were putting gas-fired plants and coal-fired plants on the same playing field. And the original proposal said you were limited to 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour for emissions for both. So EPA went back and, taking that into consideration, essentially came up with 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour for natural gas and now 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour for coal to make that differentiation. differentiation. Now, for new sources only, not for existing sources, but for new sources, those estimates assumes that carbon capture and storage is a viable and proven control technology. And there's a lot of discussion about that you've heard this morning. So, there is a 60-day public comment period that began January 8th, should end March 10th. But for those of you who take the time to look at that Federal Register, on the first page, they talk about how you make comment. There's an interesting thing that we pointed out to EPA, I'm not sure what their intent was here, I find it to be a bit problematic, is that comments must be received on or before March 10th. The comment to OMB is best assured of having its full effect if the OMB receives it by February 7th. I don't know what that means. But it suggests to me that you better get your comments in early to be fully considered. So that may turn out to be problematic for them down the road. Okay, so regulation from existing sources. Now this one certainly has a different dynamic to it. I don't think anybody at this point really knows what that's going to look like. There are a lot of discussions going on. EPA is soliciting comments from the states. We've had some, 2 or 3 conversations with the regional states on this issue and what the states' concerns might be, what we'd like to see either be included or not included in a draft regulation. I think an important point here is that the Public Service Commission has gotten engaged in the discussion, and I think that's critically important here. A letter was sent to EPA explaining the implications of any kind of new regulation for CO2 emissions, and what that might do for the depreciable life of existing plants, and moving forward in making that pitch that whatever comes out of this, there needs to be sufficient flexibility to take into account the remaining life of the facility. So I think that in the conversations with the EPA is starting to take hold. We'll have to wait and see on that. EPA is on target, based on the President's executive order, to have a draft or proposed rule out in June of 2014. One of the other things that you saw on the timeline that was put up by Dr. Friedman was that in 2015, this time 2015, June 2015, they have to have a final rule, and then the states have 1 year to have a state implementation plan in place. And one of the comments that we've made back to EPA is make sure that as we go through this process that we don't inadvertently set ourselves up for another round of sue and settle. So timing is an issue, could be an issue here as we move forward. All right, just a couple of slides here on just some of my thoughts and observations here as we move forward. First is regulatory and financial certainty. You saw the list that Barry put up and the list that I showed you here on the different regulations that have been coming down that pertain to, or from the EPA, that pertain to electric generator units. And one observation is that it can be difficult to have that regulatory certainty and make those business decisions on whether or not you want to make the retrofit for this particular regulation, not knowing what the next regulation is going to be coming down the road. And so I think to the extent that EPA can take a look at the aggregate of those regulations and how those regulations might fit together, if you're getting reductions for a particular pollutant under one new regulation, how does that fit as you move forward, and how do you give appropriate credit for those reductions? Resource implications to the state and EPA. Back in 2011, we took a look at how many new rules were coming out of EPA. And at the time, there was over 100 new rules that were coming out from EPA in that given year alone. 56 of those were air quality. that puts a tremendous amount of strain on our resources to sift through all those regulations, figure out which ones are going to have significance to the state, and then follow those through. So it's the number and pace of those rules, and also the complex nature of those rules. With that pace, and then the development or the need to develop state implementation plans, comes this whole idea of sue and settle. And if we're not strategic about how we roll out new rules, we set ourselves up, or we invite this practice of sue and settle, because we either can't keep pace, or EPA can't keep pace and review our SIPs as we submit them, and then we're subject to suit because we've missed a deadline, or they've missed a deadline. And then I would question, what's the best use of resources? I'm going to go back to regional haze and talk about that for a second. Under the regional haze plan, we believe we have met all of the requirements under the Clean Air Act and come up with a very robust plan for controlling emissions that address regional haze. Our plan also was very expensive. EPA's plan gets to the same place, at least the last version, had gotten us to the same place, but with a $1.2 billion price tag on top of what the state was proposing. Now, under the Clean Air Act, decisions on regional haze would be left to the states. That's our position. As long as we're making reasonable progress towards those goals. And we've done that. So we'll be looking at the most recent regional haze proposal from the EPA with that in mind. But when you look at the amount of resources that have been taken up for 3 versions from EPA to come across, from the state's perspective in reviewing and commenting on all of those changes proposed by EPA, the staff time on EPA's side, those resources could have been better put to other programs and other things within the agency more efficiently. So I think that's something that I would encourage EPA to take a look at as we move forward. Now, Gina McCarthy has been in her position just shy of a year as administrator of EPA. And I just wanted to show a quick quote from Gina that she made at the Harvard Law School back in July. It says, EPA cannot dictate solutions. We have to engage. I agree 100%. EPA should not be dictating solutions. And I believe Gina is sincere in that statement. And I just hope that she can find a way to get that to resonate throughout the rest of the agency. So, from the state's perspective, we want to ensure that we're protecting the state's rights. If those authorities belong with the state, then we have to make sure that we protect those rights and we engage in meaningful dialogue with the EPA. We expect that from them, and I think in turn, we should do the same. Something that has actually come out of recent discussions, and as you can imagine, at the Environmental Council of States, where we have all of the state directors have conversations about CO2 emissions and electric generating units and how we're going to regulate carbon emissions, you're going to get a pretty diverse opinion across the board. It makes it very difficult to pass any resolutions along those lines, which is what we found. But what we did realize is that eastern states, the RGGI states, actually gain the ear of the EPA on a lot of issues, because they're talking as an organization, as a group of states. So something that we're looking at right now with the leadership of North Dakota is establishing an energy-producing state summit, which would include not only the environmental directors, but the public service commissions, and potentially some industry representatives. But to talk about those issues and to get at what Dr. Friedman was saying is that, what do we want? As energy-producing states, what is it that we want to see in these CO2 regulations? They're going to happen, but what do they look like? And this is our opportunity to speak with a stronger voice in getting that message back to EPA. And then lastly, I'll just leave it with a closing statement on investment in research and technology. You heard that all through the morning. Clean coal technology, we need to continue investments in clean coal technology and carbon capture and storage, if that's going to be a viable alternative. So with that, I will close and thank you.